This feels like another episode where it's been a long time coming. I'm like, how have we not done this episode? But here we are. It's a whole episode on asynchronous development, which is just a fancy term for uneven growth and development patterns that may not follow this kind of like nice linear trajectory, which is so incredibly common with neurodivergent kids.
Yes, so today let's talk about it. What is asynchronous development? What struggles can come with it? And how can we support?
Welcome to Parenting Neurodivergent Humans. I'm Dr. Morgan Beidelman. I'm a psychologist, former teacher, parent to two kids, one of whom is neurodivergent, and I am neurodivergent myself.
And I'm Brianne Colpitz. I'm a school psychologist, parent to two neurodivergent kids, and I'm ADHD, which means I'm autistic and have ADHD.
First of all, what is uneven growth of intellectual, physical, and emotional abilities? That is a lot to unpack, even right there, and I think could be a whole episode. But, basically what we're talking about here is that you can have intellectual growth, you can have physical growth, academic growth, emotional growth. And for neurotypical individuals, there's not like perfectly on train tracks and going in this linear fashion. It's a little bit more like a slight wave, but the wave is relatively steady. It doesn't have huge waves that happen, and it tends to be on this kind of, like I said before, linear trajectory. But when we are looking at neurodivergent individuals, it is very common that there are areas that are typically developing, that there are areas that are lagging, and that there are areas that may be advanced, and that can vary even within a subject. So even within academics, you can have a lot of variance. And then you can have that also in physical development. You can also have that in emotional development as well. And it can be a little bit tricky because it is different than how our brains often like to anticipate growth.
Right. Yep. So, okay. What could this look like if you're seeing this kid out in the world or, somebody with asynchronous development? So, for example, you might see, my kid doing certain sports, doing some kind of conceptual math, or you might have a conversation with them and you're going to think, oh, wow, super advanced human here. Like this kid is such a delight, such a pleasure. But then someone might see them reading, same kid sees them reading or sees them when they're upset. They're going to think, wow, this kid's really behind, and maybe pass some kind of judgment about them being out of control or having behavior problems.
Yep. Or you may have a 10-year-old and in math, they are achieving maybe just like a 10-year-old and doing just fine. But man, out on the soccer field, they are a major star. They're playing like a 14, 15-year-old is playing, right? Just their agility and their control of the ball and everything is far physically advanced for a 10-year-old. Then you see them in reading, and their reading is 2-3 years below where it should be. And sometimes their emotional development is more like a 6-7-year-old, right? So a lot of variety in
Yep.
those skill sets. And when you see the child this is what I think happens quite often is like you see the child in one setting, you see them, a 10-year-old performing at a 10-year-old level in math, and you think, and they're going to perform at a 10-year-old in reading and, level in reading. And they're going to perform as a 10-year-old in their emotional development. And they're going to perform like a 10-year-old on the soccer field. And that is not the case.
And the joke's on you. That ain't it.
Yes. Yeah. And that pattern of behind and ahead, it creates a much wider spread of development than what we typically see in the neurotypical space. And you would expect there to be variation even within typical development. It's rare that we would test somebody. Like, let's say we were doing an academic assessment on them. It's very rare if we were looking at all academic domains, then we're talking about a 10-year-old, that even in the neurotypical space have a kid that's like performing a 10-year-old level here and here and here and here and here. That is not happening even in the neurotypical space. It's like 10 and then it's 9.4 and then it's 10.2, right? We're going to have some of that variance. But it is in the neurodivergent space that the spread is wider,
Yes, yes.
essentially.
I've heard people describe it as being many ages at once.
Yes.
Which I still feel that about myself sometimes in certain ways.
Me almost all the time. Every Friday when I make myself a box of mac and cheese for dinner, like I'm 8 and I
Yeah.
like it.
Yeah. Um, so we just want you to understand this, not something you got to fix. But one thing I want to say is that this is very common in the twice exceptional space, which we have a whole episode on twice exceptionality. But that's somebody who is neurodivergent and has a secondary neurodivergence or another neurodivergence, such as autism, ADHD, some kind of learning differences. So if you want to zoom in on that, then check out that episode. But we're going to stay zoomed in on just the asynchronous development piece of this type of a profile. So, what problems can asynchronous development cause? Well, first, this isn't inherently a problem, right? And so, as long as a kid is making progress, some of that is happening faster, some slower. That's not wrong. It's just different than what society and schools and the system has set. And so, I think we just got to understand that maybe the system is the problem and not necessarily this kid's development. So as long as they're making progress, that's what matters. Okay. Not that they're meeting certain benchmarks that people have said, like, oh, by 10 years old, people must be able to do this or that. Those things are suggestions, but I think the frustration comes in when kids aren't hitting those benchmarks or whatever, but they're still making some progress. So I don't know. Do you want to add anything to that? I feel like I mumbled that up, but I just want people to know it's not necessarily a problem.
Yeah, I see this play in addition to what you're saying, I see this play out a lot with parents right around 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. If
Yep.
their child has a learning disability, there can be this anxiety of like, is my kid ever going to be able to read? Is my kid ever going to be memorizing the math facts? And well, the math facts, they might not ever memorize, but
Right. Right.
that's okay. I still don't know about math facts and I'm doing okay.
Yep.
But that asynchronous development, sometimes, thinking through the lens of the system that you're talking about, sometimes we get to this point and we get really anxious for our child. And of course, it comes from a place of love. We want our child to have as minimal amount of struggle as possible, knowing that some struggle is good, right? And we don't really like, is this a struggle that I want my kid to have? No, I don't want my kid to persistently struggle with reading, for example. And so right around the 3rd, 4th, 5th grade mark, I think we will often see a greater level of anxiety in parents, because they're very worried. They're thinking about, holy smokes, I only have X amount of time until middle
Right.
school, and then I only have X amount of time until high school. And there's this tension that builds right in those years. And what's really interesting is I've had the joy, the opportunity to work with families through that period. So 1st, 2nd grade, started working with their child on our academic side because we have a team of clinicians who do that work. And then we have supported the kids all the way up and through middle school and high school, and or they've called us back after and they've let us know. And it's really cool because a lot of times we'll see that just the timeline was different than the system's
Yes.
timeline,
Yes. Yes.
and their kid is thriving much later on. And but there is this moment where you're like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So that's real. And there can also be misunderstandings around like, is this kid even trying?
Mhm,
And so their struggles or their asynchronous development could look like because of this system that we're working in that they're not trying. Okay. So
mhm,
that can be very
mhm.
frustrating and misleading. People see a certain level in one thing, either high or low, and they expect that across the board. And like we said, that rarely happens in any kind of a brain.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah. The other thing that comes into play here are social challenges and difficulty finding a peer group. I think about this. I had a kid and I know that they wouldn't mind this story. They lived in one neighborhood and they were in one school from for most of elementary school, and then they moved to another neighborhood, probably 4th and 5th grade, and it was brutal, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he found his people later on and he was okay, but there was this moment because, like, in little elementary school, you kind of like at the beginning, you parallel play, meaning that you're doing your own thing and the other kid next to you is doing their old thing. And so sometimes there's just more generosity
Yeah.
in the varied development, and you're like, "Oh, that's just Morgan," or like,
Yeah.
"That's just Brienne." Like, you have just a little bit more grace, but then popping him out of that environment and putting him in a new one right during this in-group, out-group thing that starts happening in those upper ages was really hard because they didn't have as much grace for
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
And they would see him doing well in one area, and they're like, "He can do it. He's just choosing
Right.
um, to be this kind of way in this other setting," and of course, he wasn't choosing it.
Yeah, that social stuff, I call it the forgiveness factor fallout, and it really does happen around like 4th grade, 5th grade, where peers start to notice the differences of their neurodivergent peers and they give them less grace and less
Mhm.
forgiveness around, I'm using air quotes here, being weird or having differences, right? Other kids are starting to perceive that. And so I talk to parents about this all the time. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yes. The other one that I
Mm.
see a lot, and you might in the 2E space as well, but kids who start having existential thoughts at time frames that we're not expecting it, or it's not showing up the way that we would think it would. We have a huge explosion of activity in the brain. There's a huge remodeling that happens in your adolescence. And one of the things that we start to do as adolescents is have existential thinking. We are like, what is this all for?
Yeah.
What is the point? What is my point? What is your point?
Yep.
And when you are having asynchronous development, that can sometimes happen early. It can sometimes happen, air quotes, late, or it can happen in just kind of like a Rubik's Cube. Like, when you take a Rubik's Cube and you kind of twist it and then it's not a square anymore because,
Yes.
like, it's like a half turn.
Yep.
That's kind of what I feel like sometimes happens for these kids in this developmental where it's like part of them is having this explosion of growth and this other part of them is just not, and it's kind of like
Right.
died for a little
Yeah.
while.
Yep. Yeah, I think in the 2E space, those existential questions, at least in my experience with raising my own kids and the kids who I support, oh my gosh, it comes early, like
Mhm.
1st grade early. And it can be triggered by like loss of a pet or like death of a family member. Or so, like, if those things happen in your life and you're raising a kid who has this asynchronous development stuff, yeah, it can be kind of overwhelming because it's like, I didn't know we were gonna have to go there, at 6 years old, but here we are. Anyway, yeah.
And then trying to figure out how to talk about it with them in a way that meets them where they're at, gives them the answers that they're looking for,
Yep.
doesn't scare them, but
Oh
doesn't
god.
doesn't coddle them. It can be
Yeah.
really, really tricky.
It's so hard.
Yeah. And sometimes it's distressing for the individual too, because they don't understand exactly what's going on for them. Like, why am I having these thoughts? Is something wrong? And right now we're in this, and this is going to sound weird, probably coming from a therapist, but we're kind of like in this space where we have had an explosion. Apparently, that's my word of the day of talking about feelings
Mm,
and emotions, but I'm not always convinced we're doing it well.
right.
And so what is happening is kids have a lot of language, but not a lot of true understanding. And so they're hearing their thoughts and they're thinking these things and they're like, am I anxious? And then they create anxiety, right? Or
Right.
"Am I depressed?" And then they create depressive symptoms for themselves. And it's really interesting trying to help them navigate through that.
Yeah, for sure.
So on that note, what do we do?
Yeah.
What do we
What
do?
can we do?
So, I mean, I think we already said this, but let's say it again. Let's just start by validating that it can be hard.
Yeah.
And then normalize the fact that everyone is different and developing differently. It doesn't matter if you're neurodivergent or you're neurotypical, everybody is developing differently, and that is okay. And that's going to be like the theme of their childhoods. And so being able to just kind of like come back to that and be really clear for them, as clear as you can be on what is happening and that it's okay. Because some of the distress comes in when we don't understand. what is happening or why it's happening.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I think as parents that we need to do is really advocate for our children in our school systems, be them public or private or independent, because you can have wonderful teachers who really, really get it. And depending on your school, they could have anywhere from 12 kids in a class to 35 kids in a class. And so even if they do get it, they might not be recognizing the patterns in your kid, not because they don't care, just because it's a lot to
Yeah.
notice patterns in every single kid. So I think that can certainly be at play. The other thing is that a lot of times school systems have systems in them for determining who gets access to what things. So for instance, you might need to have a very specific cut score to then be able to get into the advanced math class. But if your child is one of these kids who has a lot of different ability levels, they might be able to conceptually do the math. Like they really get it, but they are struggling with the executive functioning. And so they're getting the answers wrong sometimes because they missed a step in the equation, but they understand what to do. Or maybe they haven't memorized their math facts. And so that's like the prerequisite.
Right.
And so you may need to advocate for your child in that space too. The other place that I think the advocacy becomes pretty big is around behavior. If your kid has some asynchronous behavior development, and they're looking pretty neurotypical in other ways, that
Mhm.
one feels particularly challenging because
Girl,
behavior looks
ugh,
like choice.
ugh. Can we do a whole episode on this? Because stop me now. Especially for, like, giftedly verbal kids.
Mhm.
Giftedly verbal? I don't know if I said that right, but kids who are gifted in, like, their verbal abilities, but their social problem-solving skills are in the toilet, or their social interpretation skills not there yet. And, this sometimes looks like people being committed to misunderstanding your kid, but it's
Mm,
usually that they have a different understanding of how behavior works. And
mhm.
so that advocacy could look like helping people understand that actually my kid isn't choosing to do this, they just don't have the social problem solving skills figured out yet. So, perhaps they need some help with that.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. And it's also hard because if they need to be disciplined, we should discipline them. Discipline is also very valid, very important for development. And sometimes discipline isn't the issue.
Right.
And so, if you're a teacher listening, one of the things that I often do, because I do a lot of coaching and consultations in schools, I often say, and I know that people will have opinions on this, I often say discipline first. And if the discipline doesn't work, you know that it's not a boundary pushing issue. You know that this is not a kid that is just cutting up to cut up. And then you can move from there and think about what the skill deficits are. Sometimes I see teachers kind of shift all the way to one side or all the way to the other. So it's like really, really, really rigid discipline for everybody, or it's like no discipline at all. And so I try and always talk about, like, try and stay as centered as possible. Try the discipline. Like, I'm not saying don't ever discipline children. Try it. If it doesn't work, that is a good clue that you have a kid either in your classroom or in your family who has some asynchronous development in that area.
Right. I think we also forget what discipline means, that we think it means punishment
Mm-hmm.
when it really means more teaching and guiding and connecting.
And boundary setting.
Right. And so, if you got a kid who's struggling at recess, taking recess away from him every day is not going to teach him how to do recess. You know what I mean? So, yes, we need to figure it out in ways that support kids for whatever's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And, another thing around that, though, is like if you're talking to your kid, you can tell pretty quickly if your kid really is trying or if they're being naughty.
Yeah.
Uh, like if your kid is distressed about it, if they're like, I always miss recess because, whatever it is, I think most parents will know pretty quickly if it's because their kid's acting like a little turkey or if their kid needs some extra support.
Yeah. And it could be varied. Maybe
Yeah.
Monday it's turkeyness and Tuesday it's like, I really didn't know. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, that makes it even more difficult to figure it out because I don't know if I've met a kid who can't be a turkey every now and then. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like figuring it out just takes some curiosity, patience, and, trust in your kid too, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes you can just straight up ask them, and it's funny because a lot of kids will get, like, a smirk on their face, they're like, "I didn't and you're like, "Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, you can miss recess today, bro."
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Or it's like, "I didn't know," and you're like, "Yeah, okay, you actually didn't know."
Yeah. And sometimes, I will say with this, especially with this lagging social development that I often see in the twice exceptional crowd and gifted kids, it's like their perspective, it seems so outlandish sometimes, but they are being genuine. Some kids have difficulty with taking in the relevant parts of a social landscape and then interpreting those in a way that makes sense to some of us. And so their, report about recess and what they thought they were doing can seem so far fetched. But I
Mhm.
think if a kid like Morgan is saying is really like, no, like that's what I thought was happening or this or that, please believe the kid
Mm,
because sometimes we can't see how their perspective could be valid, but
yeah,
that's where their skill deficit is, like they're still having to figure this out. Their brain's wired in a way that their brain needs some help, they're not just trying to be naughty. It's like they really misunderstood the scenario. So just
yeah.
want to put that out there because I've seen that happen a lot.
Yeah, I agreed, and I think a good barometer for that is the child's distress.
Yes.
So, if a kid is distressed about something that happened, and that could be with externalizing behaviors, like having big behaviors about it, or internalizing, like shutting down, being really shy, closed off after something has happened. Those are both indicators that the kid probably didn't understand something that was happening, misinterpreted
Yep.
misinterpreted something, et cetera, et
Misread
cetera.
something. Yeah.
Yeah. Versus if a kid being naughty, that usually is a very different response. We'll see a pretty different presentation a lot of
Yep.
the time.
Yeah. I think to be able to provide kids flexibility to go at their own pace, I'm someone with no patience. So that's a life lesson for me in parenting and just working with humans is hey, everybody has their own rhythm and it might not match yours. So just remembering to give kids that flexibility so they can set their own pace, I think is supportive. Look for spaces where kids can dive into things that they are ahead on. Sometimes that's a special interest. Sometimes it's getting into robotics or going in a deep dive in a certain direction so that feels good on the self esteem piece. And I think try to reduce the stigma around things that they are, air quotes here, behind on.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with an episode about life as a neurodivergent adult.
If we are a good fit for you, follow us on Instagram. Dr. Morgan is at Dr. Morgan Beitelman, and Brienne is at It's Brienne Colpitts. You can find the podcast on YouTube and Patreon at Parenting Neurodivergent Humans.
And as always, if you have a question or topic you want us to cover, send us a note. You can message us on Instagram or use the Google form in the show notes.
And as always, thank you to our editor and producer, Erica Carpenter. We appreciate you.
Thanks for joining us. See you next week.
Just a quick disclosure, this podcast is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute a psychologist-client relationship and should not be used in place of an expert evaluation or therapy.